Nestled in the heart of Brookfield, a small, secluded village surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, lived Henry Walker, a man of quiet disposition. His farmhouse, built with care by generations of his family, stood at the edge of the woods, its wooden beams weathered by time. The field stretched endlessly before him, a patchwork of green and gold where the grains of wheat swayed in the breeze. The land had been in his family for generations, passed down from great-grandparents who had once tilled the soil with bare hands and lived off the harvest. It was a life of simplicity, hard work, and patience. At 45, Henry had become accustomed to solitude. His wife, Emma, had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him with only memories and the silence of the farmhouse. His 2 children had grown up and moved to the city, pursuing careers and lives far removed from the humble farm where they had been raised. Henry's days were long, filled with the demands of farming, planting, harvesting, fixing fences, and tending to the animals. Though he had his routine, the isolation sometimes felt unbearable. It was as if the land, which had always been a source of pride, had become a constant reminder of what he had lost. Each morning, Henry woke early, long before the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. He'd gather his tools, check on the animals, and begin his work in the fields. The days were spent in a quiet rhythm, his thoughts often wandering to the days when his children played in the yard, when laughter filled the air, and the house was alive with warmth. Now, the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional crow of a rooster, and the soft rustling of his dog, Buster, following him loyally from task to task. But life on the farm wasn't always peaceful. There were always problems to deal with, pests eating away at the crops, leaks in the barn roof that needed patching, or the threat of wild animals that sometimes ventured too close. One late autumn afternoon, as Henry was walking through his fields, checking the grain, something caught his eye. A small figure dashed between the rows of crops, a flash of red fur. It was a fox. At first, Henry thought nothing of it. He had seen foxes on the farm before, though they usually kept their distance. But this fox seemed different. It didn't dart away at the sight of him, instead, it paused, watching Henry from the far end of the field, its bright eyes locked onto his. Henry stood still, his gaze meeting the fox's, a silent moment passing between them. He had always heard the whispers of his grandparents, tales of how wild creatures sometimes knew more than they let on, how they could sense a person's soul, their intentions. For days, the fox kept appearing, always at a distance. It seemed to watch Henry with a curious gaze, never approaching too closely but always lingering just within view. Henry, intrigued by the animal's behavior, began to wonder what it was that drew the fox to him. Was it the food he left out for the wild animals? Or was there something deeper, an instinctual connection that neither of them fully understood? As the days turned to weeks, the fox's presence became more frequent. It would appear at dawn, just as the sun began to rise over the horizon, or at dusk, when the golden light of the setting sun made the field shimmer. Henry began to notice that the fox seemed to follow him as he worked. He would catch glimpses of it watching him from the edge of the barn or darting between the trees, always keeping a safe distance but never straying too far. One morning, while Henry was mending the fence near the edge of his property, he noticed the fox again, standing just a few yards away, staring at him intently. This time, it didn't retreat into the trees like it usually did. Instead, it stayed there, motionless, watching Henry's every move. Henry paused, feeling a strange pull in his chest. It was as if the fox wanted something from him, or perhaps was waiting for him to make the first move. Without thinking, Henry slowly lowered his hand toward the fox, offering it an olive branch, so to speak. He had no intention of trying to touch the fox or lure it closer, but something in him told him to extend the gesture. The fox blinked slowly, almost as if considering the offer. It took a step forward, sniffing the air, then another. Slowly, cautiously, it approached Henry's outstretched hand. For a long moment, it hovered just out of reach. Then, the fox did something surprising. It brushed its head against Henry's hand, almost as though it were seeking comfort. It was a gentle, almost affectionate gesture, one that made Henry's heart swell with a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. The fox stepped back, its bright eyes never leaving his, and for the first time, Henry realized that this wasn't just a wild animal, it was something more, something that shared his loneliness, even if only for a moment. The encounter left Henry speechless, his mind racing with questions. Why had the fox come so close? Why had it trusted him when it was clear it had no reason to? He couldn't explain it, but a quiet understanding had passed between them, one that neither of them could deny. From that day forward, the bond between Henry and the fox grew deeper. Each day, the fox would appear at different times, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes in the late evening. It seemed to be drawn to Henry's presence, always watching, always curious, but never intruding on his space. The fox would sit nearby as Henry worked, sometimes lying down in the sun to nap, sometimes sitting upright with its tail curled neatly around its paws, observing the man who had become a part of its world. Henry, in turn, began to feel a sense of peace when the fox was around. It wasn't the same kind of companionship he had once shared with his late wife or children, but it was a companionship nonetheless. There was something calming about the fox's quiet presence, as though the world could slow down for just a little while. Henry began to look forward to the fox's visits, which had become a reassuring part of his routine. Despite the growing trust between them, Henry knew the fox was still wild. It never tried to get too close, never sought affection in the way a domesticated animal might. But there was a sense of mutual respect. Henry had earned the fox's trust, and in return, the fox seemed to acknowledge him as something more than just a human. It was a bond based on silence, on understanding, and on a shared sense of survival in the wilderness. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. The fox began to bring Henry small gifts, a rabbit's fur, a handful of berries, or sometimes even a freshly caught fish. At first, Henry didn't understand why the fox was bringing him these things, but as time passed, he realized it was the fox's way of showing gratitude. The gifts were simple, but they were deeply meaningful. It was as if the fox was saying, "I trust you. You are part of my world, too." One particularly harsh winter, Brookfield was hit by a severe snowstorm that lasted for days. The snow piled up high against the cabin's door, and the temperatures dropped well below freezing. Henry knew the storm was dangerous, but he had dealt with worse in the past. However, this storm was unlike any he had experienced. It was relentless, the wind howling through the trees, the snow coming down in thick sheets. Henry spent most of his days inside, keeping the fire going and making sure his livestock was safe. But on the third day of the storm, the worst happened. A branch from a large tree near his barn fell, blocking the entrance to the barn and trapping his animals inside. Henry had to get out there and clear the snow, but the storm was too fierce, and he didn't want to risk getting caught outside in the blizzard. As he sat by the fire, trying to figure out a way to get the animals out, he heard a scratching at the door. He froze. The last person he expected to see was the fox. But there it was, standing at the door, its fur matted with snow, its eyes bright and determined. The fox didn't hesitate. It brushed against the door as if asking Henry to open it. Without thinking, Henry did, and to his surprise, the fox dashed inside, shaking off the snow and looking at him with urgency. It wasn't like the fox to seek shelter inside, but tonight, it seemed as if the wild creature knew something Henry didn't. Henry decided to follow the fox's lead. He grabbed his coat, ready to go out into the storm. The fox led him toward the barn, moving through the snow with astonishing speed. As they approached the barn, the fox took a moment to nudge open a gap in the door, creating just enough space for Henry to squeeze through. The animals were safe. For the first time, Henry realized the fox hadn't just brought him warmth, it had led him to the animals, ensuring their safety. Without the fox's intervention, Henry might have lost everything in that storm. In the weeks that followed the storm, Henry's connection with the fox deepened even further. He began to see the fox not just as a wild animal but as a companion, someone who shared in the challenges of life on the farm. They had both survived the harsh winter together, each depending on the other in their own way. Henry started to leave food out for the fox regularly, though the fox never took more than it needed. It wasn't about taking advantage of Henry's kindness, it was about mutual respect. And as spring approached, Henry began to see the fox in a new light, not as just a creature of the wild, but as part of his extended family, a partner in survival. As the years passed, the bond between Henry and the fox only grew stronger. Though the fox never became a pet, it was always there, a constant presence on the farm. Henry's life had been forever changed by the unlikely friendship he had formed with a wild animal, a bond based on trust, respect, and a shared understanding of life in the wilderness. The fox had become a symbol of the wild's unpredictability and beauty, and it had shown Henry that even in the solitude of the woods, companionship could be found in the most unlikely of places. Together, Henry and the fox had weathered storms, faced dangers, and shared moments of quiet peace. Their friendship was a testament to the power of connection, how even the wildest creatures could offer something precious and irreplaceable. And as Henry grew older, he knew that the fox, though wild and free, had given him something far greater than just companionship. It had reminded him of the beauty of life, the importance of trust, and the extraordinary ways the world could bring two beings together, no matter how different they seemed. And so, in the quiet corners of the woods, Henry and the fox remained, a symbol of an unspoken bond that would never be broken.